I rā rangatira mā, tēnā koutou. Kia mihi ahau ki ngā mana whenua, Ngāti Whātua Ōrāki. I mihi ahoki ki ngā iwi o te motu, eina iwi o te moana, nui a kiwa, eina hoe whā. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Ni Sambula, kia rāna, talo whalawa, malo I leilei, talo whalasi, whakalofa atu, kamna Māori, aloha. Mi lookum some whalaman below in Papua New Guinea, mo Solomon, mo Vanuatu, e mi stop, mi welcome all get a long place here too. Welcome to the inaugural NZIPR, or New Zealand Institute for Pacific Research Conference. It gives me great pleasure as Acting Director of the Institute to welcome you. And you should be actually hearing from a fellow Pacific researcher, Associate Professor Yvonne Underhill-Sem, who is the Director of the Institute, but she is currently overseas. So you have an old Palangi instead of a rather attractive Cook Islander to welcome you here. I'm not going to spend too long at the moment on the welcome remarks, other than to acknowledge gratefully the support that the Institute has had from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and in fact it's out of that arrangement between the Ministry and a consortium of universities, Auckland University, the Auckland University of Technology, and the University of Otago, that this conference and the research that, much of the research that will be reported here has its origins. So an initial acknowledgement to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Consortium of Universities. One brief housekeeping matter, I'll deal with other ones later. If you are speaking, you will automatically have your address live streamed. I thought you were going to need a little lapel microphone, but apparently you won't, so that won't be a big interruption in your speaking. We're delighted that our first speaker this morning is a minister who comes from Auckland and also who has worked at this university in the area of Pacific Health in the past. The Minister, Carmel Sepuloni, who's Minister of Social Development, Minister of Disabilities, Associate Minister for Pacific Peoples, and also Associate Minister for Arts, Culture and Heritage, that's a massive load, has found time to be able to come and address us. So I won't waste any more time in welcoming our Minister. Thank you very much for the time you've given us today.
Thank you, Richard. Talofalava malorele, whakalofalahi atu ni tambula vinaka. Kia orana, taloha ni. And good morning, everyone. It's such a privilege to be here at the University of Auckland, a place where I've spent 10 years of my 41 years either as a student or working, particularly here at the Whale Pasifika in the Faculty of Arts, where for 5 years I worked as the equity manager. And at a research conference, given that my last job here was actually managing the non-Pacific, the non-regulated Pacific Health Workforce Research Project that was run through the Faculty of Medical and Health Sciences just before I got into Parliament. So it is fantastic to be back in this wonderful place. And can I just acknowledge the space that I haven't had the opportunity to visit recently, but particularly acknowledging the artists that have contributed to this. I look around and I think of people like Felipe Tohi, who did the lashings, the late Jim Viviari, the wonderful John Pule, and so many others that have contributed to this amazing whale that we get to enjoy here at the University of Auckland. And looking around, I see so many familiar faces. Friendly, familiar faces. So it is so great to be back here today, and wonderful to have been invited to come along to open this conference, Oceans and Islands, and great to be with you this morning to celebrate and be part of showcasing Pacific research. As Minister for Social Development and Disability Issues, as well as Associate Minister for Pacific Peoples and Arts, Culture and Heritage, I really do have the privilege of being able to witness the great contribution that Pacific leaders, academics and communities in general make to Aotearoa and globally. In particular, can I start by just acknowledging the excellence of the research that we see here and now, reflecting on the past and moving forward. It's wonderful to see the establishment of consultancies like Moana Research, led by Dr. Tewila Percival, Jacinta Fa'alili Fido, Dr. Saini Taufa and Dudley Gentles, who really are signalling the very real need for Pacific people to be included and valued within our broader research community. And the crucial role that this can play in affecting meaningful change for Pacific peoples and Aotearoa more broadly. Can I also acknowledge the recent appointment of Toi Ole Sulu Damon Salesa as Pro Vice-Chancellor Pacific to the University of Auckland. This appointment is significant for bringing Pacific people's perspectives to the leadership table of a leading tertiary provider, but the nature of this appointment is elevated even more so by the international reputation that Toi Ole Sulu Damon Salesa brings to this role. So I really want to congratulate Damon and the University of Auckland for this significant step. Whilst I'm here, I also want to acknowledge the contribution that some of our other leading academics in this space are making. People like our co-head of school for Māori and Pacific Studies, Dr. Jemima Tiatia, who has committed so much of her life to researching and gaining and sharing such valuable insights into Pacific peoples and mental health, and who now is contributing as part of the inquiry panel for the inquiry into mental health in New Zealand. Whilst here, I also want to acknowledge, I saw her floating around earlier, the Pro-Vice-Chancellor Māori, Professor Cindy Kiro, who has a huge reputation for working with and for some of our most vulnerable, particularly with roles like having been the Children's Commissioner, and who now leads the Expert Advisory Group for Welfare Reform, a piece of work that I've commissioned, and I've worked very closely with Professor Cindy Kiro, and can I just say what a huge contribution she is making and what such valuable insights that she brings to that very important piece of work. As we're all aware, Pacific communities, researchers and scholars have a great deal to offer our research community, but I think just the mention of the few people that I've already made really indicates the value of research, but the way in which that extends outside of research institutions like the University of Auckland and the contribution that that can make to Pacific people in contemporary New Zealand and the broader region in ways that I think that we're really beginning to realise here in 2018. As the late Teresia Taiwa noted when discussing Pacific studies, when she said we are, quote, literally oceanic in proportions, end quote, as a region with 1,200 indigenous languages and 20,000 islands spread over a third of the Earth's surface. Research about this part of the world will be a critical contribution to, or will make a critical contribution to grappling with some of the broader international challenges we face as a global community. From this perspective, it's great to see that your Congress will canvass such broad-ranging themes from sustainable development, energy and technology, to Pacific ethics and managing land and natural resources. Recently, while attending the Oceania exhibition in London, I spoke about the significant cultural dimension of the opening ceremony being a reminder that the exhibition is a reflection of living people and cultures that remain connected even over vast time and space. And it may seem a strange link to make, but I think this is an important point to remind ourselves of, especially when it comes to research and ethics, that the research and ethics that sit behind our research agendas. I'm sure many will agree with the importance of striking a careful balance between valuing our region and perspectives whilst also being able to have informed and critical perspectives. I also spoke about the opportunity to rebalance our history books. What I mean here is that the Pacific artists at the exhibition provided a pathway to garner a better understanding of the Pacific and our place in the world. Research by Pacific for Pacific also affords us that same opportunity. I really want to commend the efforts of many of you here who have been pioneers in your fields, ensuring that there is now a growing community of Pacific researchers that other emerging Pacific academics can draw from as they commence their academic careers. I want to touch on a couple of things closer to home and some of the research initiatives that I've been directly involved in. In the last budget, you will have seen that we extended funding to the Growing Up in New Zealand study. The decision was about a range of things, including, from my perspective, the importance of maintaining the integrity of a longitudinal study that families had committed and given consent to being part of. But it was also about the fact that a reduced sample size of such a significant study could potentially impact on communities like Māori and Pacific. And I think that's a really good example of the importance of all of us being cognizant of what are sometimes perceived as invisible impacts, but really are important to us. I'm also really pleased that we are slowly seeing better Pasifika research perspectives provided at the government level. Treasury's Pasifika Economic Report, which was launched at the Pacific Aotearoa Summit in Auckland earlier this month, using Treasury's Living Standards framework to identify the economic footprint of Pacific communities. It reveals Pacific peoples are contributing significantly to the economy despite a multitude of challenges. While the research focused on the monetary value of the Pacific economy, the government recognises that this is not the only measure that we should be using to measure wealth or contributions to New Zealand. The report also quantified the staggering contribution Pacific people contribute to voluntary work, recording 27,000 volunteer hours a week, or 1.4 million hours a year. This enormous voluntary contribution not only benefits Pacific community, it also contributes to New Zealand's national well-being and the enjoyment of life of all our people. And as a government, can I say a statement that the Prime Minister's used quite often, that I refer to whenever I get the opportunity, is that where we are able, we should be supporting people to be earning, learning, volunteering or caring. All of those things are important. In the past, I think the focus has primarily been on paid employment, not undermining the importance of that, but wanting to also elevate the importance of learning, caring and volunteering as well. I also want to mention the Lalanga Whau report produced by the Ministry for Pacific Peoples, which captures what communities have told us are important to them. It identifies 4 priority areas for action and change. Firstly, Pacific people want their diverse languages and cultures to be valued and recognised as an asset to Aotearoa. Secondly, it's about prosperity for our Pacific people and communities. The third area is resilient and healthy Pacific people and children, and the final priority area is confident, thriving and resilient Pacific young people. The 2 reports that I refer to are examples of quantitative and qualitative research, and as the Minister responsible for the Social Investment Agency, I think it's vital that we value both types of research to help in supporting the government to make decisions for this country. We know that quantitative is incredibly important, but equally what is important is ensuring that we do not discount human experiences. The government has already begun working more closely with Pacific communities to co-design solutions to some of the inequalities Pacific people face. And as Pacific research grows, I expect the inclusion of these perspectives to grow from strength to strength. I also hope that many of you in this room will work alongside us to support us in the journey as both valuable allies, but respected critics as well. In closing, it's critical that Pacific people are meaningfully included in thought leadership and decision making. We must be the authors of our own solutions, and conferences like this support us towards that end. Pacific values must inform how things are done, and we need to recognise Pacific communities as the owners of Pacific wellbeing and culture. The challenge now is to keep up the momentum so we can drive real change to help Pacific people realise their full potential. I want to thank you again for the opportunity to open this conference. Can I say again, or re-articulate again, your research is critical to helping us design the right policies and programs to not only tackle the challenges our Pacific communities face, but also, and equally as importantly, to highlight and leverage off the many opportunities that exist. You've got a really diverse program ahead of you over the next 2 days, and I hope that you take this time to renew your networks and encourage your conversations, and I encourage your conversations about contemporary Pacific issues. I really do look forward to seeing what comes out of it, and genuinely hope that, and I'm sure you will, that you all enjoy this conference. Thank you very much for the invitation to be part of it. Whawhatai lava.
Well, that was a great way to start the conference. A lot of challenges, a lot of suggestions on how we can get the most out of this opportunity we have being together. Thank you, Minister Sepuloni, for a very important address to get us on our way. We are going to move progressively through a series of keynote presentations before we break for morning tea. I'm not sure whether the Minister's able to stay and join us for a few or whether you have to leave. She has to go back to Wellington. So let's just express again our sincere appreciation to the Minister for her presentation. And I think there might be a small... Bad luck, Minister. Not this time, next time. But thank you very much. Gives me pleasure now to welcome Associate Professor Damon Salesa to address us. One of the things, the many things that he has done is to also have been the inaugural director of this institute, and he played a major part in the establishment of the institute and the development of the relationship between the universities, the 3 universities, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Damon is very widely known for his research as an historian, as a social commentator. His latest book, published by Bridget Williams Books, is on Island Time, is a very important contribution to the debates on a wide range of areas in New Zealand. Including one that is quite close to my heart at the moment as someone involved in the Building Better Homes, Towns and Cities National Science Challenge. Damon's book contains many provocative suggestions and comments about how we need to address far more effectively issues relating to housing and shelter for Pacific peoples. It is now my privilege to invite Damon to come and address us with his keynote comments. Damon.
Maro le soifua ma langi mama, kia ora koutou, ngā mihi nui, nau mai haere mai ki tēnei hui. Maro lei, ko le kewhanga he whakatāpū. Kia ora ana, Isa Bulavanaka, namaste, taloha ni. I think we can all be released from speaking as many languages as we can at the start, which will hasten the race to knowledge that we're part of. Why Pacific research matters, I think, was just exhibited by one of the most important leaders in our country, the Minister Carmel Sepuloni. We have a minister who is quoting Pacific Studies scholars and is using that work in one of the largest portfolios New Zealand has, social development. I'm proud she's an alumna of this university, and particularly of this place and of the School of Education. Pacific research and Pacific knowledge matters. And so we're all here for those reasons, not just to know new things, but because new knowledge transforms the world we're in. And I guess most of us conceive of our knowledge work, our teaching and research, as a tautua, as a service to our communities. So a special welcome to the Minister who's left, and to all of you who've come from afar, whether afar is across the road, or in the Waikato, or from Hawaii, or Fiji, or beyond. It is our honour to welcome you, and especially to welcome you here to the Whale Pacifica. Our university is your home, and particularly we built this whale and the we is not me, it's genuinely a we built it for you. It is the Pacific home on campus. Every conference we hold is the result of so much tautua. And so I particularly wanted to acknowledge the directorate, which is what we have at the moment, of the NZIPR, the acting director, Professor Dick Bedford, the previous acting director, Dr. Lisu Peresa, and Yvonne Underhill-Sem, the current director. I wanted to acknowledge especially Dr. Evelyn Masters at the front for her work in leading this program, Seira Okuso Sue and Tegehia Porsini for their work in making today happen, as well as the people who care for this whale, Betty Bernard and the whale crew. All of this makes knowledge possible. And Pacific research and knowledge means more than just research about the Pacific and its people. And it's not simply research about the Pacific by Pacific people that makes it Pacific research. It is more than that. Pacific research responds to the knowledge formations, the priorities, understandings, and cultures of Pacific peoples. And it has faced, as many of us in this room know, many struggles. It has faced the struggle to be properly resourced and given the necessary opportunities to succeed. It has faced the struggles of coming up against the determinative constraints of pre-existing disciplines, pre-existing formations of knowledge, which only allow what has been, right, and only recognize what has been within certain tramlines and ways of seeing. Above all, the struggle of Pacific researchers doing Pacific research has been to be recognized. And recognition is the foundation act of receiving authority. And above all, the struggle has been to be recognized as knowledge, not as primary givers of information, which is then reconfigured into knowledge by other researchers, but to recognize that those who hold knowledge in our communities, who practice it according to contemporary or ancient traditions, are knowledge makers, knowledge holders, and knowledge practitioners. That there are other ways of doing research than those that were to be found at universities in the 1930s. And so that was the struggle that the NZIPR embarked on. And the consortium AUT, the Auckland University of Technology, Otago, the University of Otago, and the University of Auckland undertook to advance. These are three of the most important research institutions in New Zealand. And I think it's important to remark that so much has been achieved by NZIPR so quickly. One is the formal research program, a bunch of 5 research programs which will be signed off, completed, or published by the end of this year. Disseminating research through both online platforms and published ones, monthly newsletters, the Auckland University of Technology Media Centre. Developing and maintaining a research repository to make visible different kinds of knowledge, which is still active. And above all, and I think most importantly, building the research capability and the research recognition of a diverse range of researchers. That includes over a dozen scholarships, sponsorship for individual researchers and individual research projects, and hosting talks on everything from climate change to the Pacific Reset to the one which was held last night on foreign donor aid in the Pacific. The NZIPR has been present with its peer institutions and its partner institutions. Now, all of that has happened rapidly and has happened in a challenged position. I think the landscape has changed now, and actually Minister Sepuloni had me reflect that we live in the world's largest Polynesian country. And we now welcome that of the 24 ministers of the Crown in New Zealand, 14 of them are Polynesian. For those of us who imagine a time when that was very far from the case or can remember that time, we will know so much has changed. That as the ministers were sworn in, the people who govern our nation, the heavenly languages of Te Reo Māori, of Samoan and Tongan echoed around Government House as ministers took their oath in their heritage or first language. That means we are living in the future time, which I've called island time, where what has changed has already happened. The leadership of our nation reminds us we live in a Pacific nation, and there are many people in New Zealand who have yet to realise it. But they're not those in charge. So the research leadership has gone this way as well in New Zealand, and we'll see it. Pacific studies and Māori studies, which neighbour each other on our campus and inside this aukati that wraps around us, are the two perhaps most enduring interdisciplinary formations on campus. And what they have advanced, and particularly what we see in Pacific research, which doesn't just happen in Pacific studies, but across, we've seen my colleagues from sociology, from health and education, happens across the university, has to look like that. Pacific research can't just be about foreign policy and development studies. And I think we miss so many opportunities if that's true. And in the next 2 days, we will see what happens if we are embracing and inclusive and open to the voices that speak on so many different Pacific issues. In the next couple of days, we'll address Pacific pedagogies, Indigenous social work, dance, wealth management, vanilla. Now, I know that a lot of this pushes at the edges of what many funders and adjudicators of research are comfortable with. And I love that about Pacific research. That's why I suspect so many of us are here and why the composition of this room looks very different to some other conferences. I've long argued that the future of much of what we do in New Zealand is to be seen first in the Pacific and first in New Zealand amongst Pacific communities. And what you see and hear in the next 2 days will prove that that view is correct, I think. It will foreshadow the future of Pacific research for sure, but it will also foreshadow the future of research more generally. Full stop. Last century, so more than 20 years ago, and actually we have a minister quoting Teresia, our late colleague Teresia Teua, right? I think last century, 40 years ago, nearly, E Pili Hauofa talked about a sea of islands. That little essay, which is one of the most, probably the most widely cited piece in Pacific studies, has worked its way to be cited in UN conferences by ministers of the Crown and now sits behind a strategic argument of an entire region where we've gone from talking about small island states to large ocean nations. Right? We've gone about talking about islands in a far or distant sea and remoteness to talking about the blue continent. This is what I mean about witnessing the future, and for the critics and conscience of the Pacific, which is Pacific research is partly their role, delivering a future for us. Another example, and the minister brought this one up, and I wanted to remind everyone about this one, is about the same time Pacific researchers in health and education took up the idea of health, and many of them are in this room today. I see Fui Maono amongst them. And what they did was they pushed at that concept of health as being too limited, as being too centred on a very limited notion, which is essentially biomedicine, right? They expanded the horizons of what should be health to include things like well-being, to put Pacific notions of culture and spirituality inside and pushing at the margins of what constituted a policy notion of health, right? As a result of the workers, the knowledge workers, and particularly our Pacific political leaders and community leaders, New Zealand now has an infrastructure of Pacific health providers, right? That's probably the largest Pacific health provision network in the world, but I don't have a basis for saying that, so don't. What they did was they mobilised in health documents, which had previously been the preserve of doctors and technical policymakers, metaphors for whale, metaphors for waka, for relationships, for structures, and they put those inside concepts of health, right? And Māori research workers were on a similar path, and this is 30 years ago, right? This transformed the New Zealand concept of what counted as health. And then we fast forward to this year, where I was pleased to enjoy, and some of you will have been subjected to this as well, a long and insightful vision of New Zealand's economic future from, in my instance, the Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. And what they put forward is now what will turn up in New Zealand's first ever well-being budget next year. So we have economists talking about well-being. We have them talking about the 4 capitals, which include spiritual, cultural capital, which looks very similar to things we've been talking about for a long time. This should brace us and hearten us, right? These are all familiar stories to Māori and Pacific researchers from 20 years ago. And now they're emanating from the people who hold our nation's budget and its treasure, the Treasury. So I welcome us to a place and a space and an occasion where the future of research truly will be on display. It may not be evident to people outside of this space for decades even, but it will be heard eventually. It may not, though, be footnoted, which is probably our trouble. So I congratulate you on all the work that has brought you here. I thank you for your participation in this conference. I thank you for your work and service to Pacific Knowledge, because Pacific Knowledge is a service to Pacific communities. We congratulate the NZIPR, its leaders and its support staff, and the work of our 3 brother and sister institutions. So that's the University of Auckland, the University of Otago, and the Auckland University of Technology. I think it's fitting to finish with a Samoan saying which recalls the ocean and wishes us good luck. Malo le whai whaiwa. Whakatau.
I knew there were some presents hiding somewhere. Damon, I have a little gift for you. Very much for an inspiring address. I think we've been really privileged in our opening speakers to be given so many thoughtful comments on the research, on the Pacific, on New Zealand, and on where we might be heading in the future. This is a really great way to get the conference underway. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce an old friend and colleague from the Western Pacific, Professor David Gegeo. I've had the privilege of working with David in the past when he worked in New Zealand as director of the Macmillan Brown Centre at the University of Canterbury, and he served as an examiner on a number of theses that one or two of which I had had the privilege of being involved with as a supervisor. He brings to the conference, I think, some very important reflections on Indigenous epistemologies, on ways of knowing that matter enormously for people who are wanting to make a future in this blue continent in the Pacific. So please, first of all, thank Damon again, and at the same time, welcome David to the podium.
Well, let me begin first with an apology, and that's that I reacted to something on the plane, and so I lost my voice. I usually am a better speaker than I am now. So, yeah, sorry. And then the second thing also is that you'll see in the booklet that when Dr. Evelyn Masters asked for a photograph to go, I think my secretary sent her an old picture. That's why it doesn't look so young. The new picture should be what you see now. So, thank you very much. I truly appreciate being here, and it's like coming back home. And as my friend Dick Bedford mentioned, this is really, and I've given presentations in this Fale for many, many times, and it's great to be here. And I think I kind of see some familiar faces. But it's been 5 years, I think, since I left, and during that time, a lot has happened. And all right, I have a PowerPoint, Let me just, first of all, convey my word of expression, or my word of gratitude to the people who brought me here. First of all, the New Zealand Research Institute for Pacific Research. Thank you so much, Evelyn and the others, for bringing me here. Director, Professor Yvonne and the Hillsound. I take it that from Dick that she's away at the moment. Cambridge, I think, or somewhere in England. And also, I'd like to thank Acting Director, Professor Richard Bedford, who's here, and members of the Organizing Committee, Dr. Evelyn Masters, Research Program Manager, and Tegehia Posini, and also Sarah Okuso Sue, for making it possible for me to come here and be part of this wonderful conference. And also, I'd like to thank Maori, Toa Ana Whanua, or Tangata Whanua, for their continual kindness and heart to allow us to be here and sort of do our business on their land. I mean, this may be the University of Auckland, but it's their land. I mean, when it comes to indigeneity, it's their land. So I'd like to express my deepest gratitude for that. And then government and church dignitaries, if there are any here, well, the ministers left. And fellow Pacific researchers, scholars, and professionals, all of you. And ladies and gentlemen, it's great to be here, and thank you very much for making this occasion possible for me to be here. Now, a conference in my culture, it's like a feast. And the speaker is someone who's like, in that old anthropological language, a big man, which I really don't agree with, but someone who sends out invitations, and then everybody comes to the feast with food. And so I see what I'm presenting here really is the help, of the connection that I've made with people reading their work over the years and who have inspired me. I use the word epistemic inspiration and empowerment quite heavily to pay tribute and express my gratitude that people have helped me over the years. Professor Linda Tuhiwai-Smith, Professor Makere Stewart Harawira, Professor Richard Bedford, I hope that's not getting too much, Professor Vijay Naidu, so also helped for his work a lot. Professor Kabini Sanga, my one talk, I don't know if he's here in the, oh yeah, he's back there, all right, yeah. All right. Professor Yvonne and the Hillsem, who's, again, like I said, away. And Professor Malakai Kulamatangi, I don't know if he's here, but he's someone whose work I've already read quite widely. Professor Sitiveni Rambuk, no, not Rambuk, Ratuva. Oh, sorry, if you're in here, Bulavinaka, I didn't mean to. They start with R's, but Ratuva. Also, my word of thanks to the late Professor Kapilialoha. He's someone whose work has inspired me quite a lot. Professor Konai Thaman at the USP, whose work I also read and value from quite a lot. Professor Sailau Suali, I know that he's here in Auckland. These people, and just a few more, and then I'll go move on. Professor Manulani Myers, I've read her work and valued so much from her work. All right, Professor Haunani K. Trask, bow to her. I've learned so much from her. Professor Tassisius Tarakabutolaka, Solomon Under, who's at UH at the moment. Professor Vince Diaz, Professor Peggy Dunlop Fairburn, someone who's I've read quite a lot and really valued from it. Professor Unaisi Nabobo Baba, a Fijian scholar whose work was quite inspiring for me. Professor Clooney McPherson, very prominent. Judy Bennett, Professor Judy Bennett has helped me in terms of Solomons wealth history. Professor David Roby, I saw that you here somewhere. Oh, you're over there, all right, man. Blood on your banners. I use the text a lot for my teaching, all right, on movements in the Pacific. Professor Clive Moore, also Professor Karen Ann Watson Gegeo, fact that you've separated from someone doesn't mean you stop appreciating their work. We still work together. Professor Melanie and I've also valued from her work. Professor Morgan Tuimale Ali'ifana, another inspiration for me in his work on Pacific history. Reverend Professor Upolo Luma Fa'ai. I also do the epistemology of Christian transformation in the Pacific, and his work has been very inspirational in that. And then Professor Dr. Elaisia Tuwere. Much more. I would feel like I'm cheating if I don't mention these people, who are the pillars of my work and my intellectual growth, transformation, and empowerment. So I would like to take that time to do that. All right. The legacy of research on indigenous Pacific people. A quote from Linda Tuhiwai Smith said, research is probably one of the dirtiest words in the indigenous world's vocabulary. When mentioned in many indigenous contexts, it stirs up silence, it conjures up bad memories, it raises a smile that is knowing and distrustful. I think in many ways it captures how we people feel, in not only the Pacific, but other parts of the world as well. So given this legacy or negative experience, why do we, all of us, Pacific, all of us, keep doing research in Pacific Island communities? Given this, against a backdrop, why do we keep doing research on Pacific communities? Why have Pacific Island academics and other professionals jump on the bandwagon? I'm starting with questions, but I'll come back to some answers. Why do Pacific Islands academics and professionals keep talking about the indigenization or the oceanization of Pacific research methodologies, pedagogies, epistemologies, ontologies, paradigms, etc., when the impact that research has had on our people is, as Linda Tuiwai Smith has so eloquently expressed above? These are questions that I hope I'll be. Are we doing the right thing in jumping on this research bandwagon, not only but conducting research on our own people, on their own communities? All right, if Pacific academics and professionals are the ones who are talking about or taking the lead in the revolution of epistemic decolonization in the Pacific, how can we be sure that what we're doing is actually epistemically decolonizing and not something else? All right? How can we be sure that the decolonizing transformation or epistemic paradigm shift we are talking or we are seeking to bring about in knowledge construction in the Pacific is actually epistemic and not political? How can we know that? Who has the epistemic expertise to give us that ruling or answer? Some question when I look at research in the Pacific. Now, how serious is epistemic decolonization in the Pacific, such that important research organizations such as NZIPR have taken it or have come aboard on this journey? All right, but we're not alone. At this stage, we all know we're not alone, we meaning Pacific researchers. Pacific epistemic communities are not alone in the quest for the indigenization or oceanization of research and knowledge construction in the Pacific. At this stage, we're not alone anymore. All right? We have been given great support and encouragement by metacentrist epistemic communities. Now, I use the word metacentrist instead of Western, because I think that word has sort of gone stale. Not only that, but when it comes to knowledge, the globalization of the world, what comes out of, say, Los Angeles or UCLA or other places, it's not just Western anymore. So I'm trying to stay away from that. Because when we say it's Western, what about Japanese scholars, Chinese scholars who contributed to that body of knowledge? Where do they stand? And so when we keep using the word or the concept Western, I think we're underprivileging their contribution. And so I sort of came up with that word. All right? And I say here that two epistemic communities must work together. Very true. And university-trained Pacific epistemic community must also work together with what I see as indigenous or village epistemic communities. And in working together, we sort of give greater representation to epistemic voice in terms of knowledge construction in the Pacific. All right, and greater ownership of epistemic enterprise and the epistemic product. Now, you can see I'm coming from philosophy. But it's the same thing. We talk about the same thing. It's just using different language, but same thing. All right, and this is what I see as what we need to be working towards. What I see here as a collaboration of epistemic communities in epistemic paradigm shift or epistemic decolonization of the Pacific. We have to work together. And I'm saying this because I've come across situations where people say we really need to develop Pacific-based methodologies or methods or techniques. Fine, I'm all for that. I've been all for that. But I hope that that positioning is not against ruling others out of that quest. So I think we have a better chance of answering some of our lingering questions in research when we work together as this team here. University-trained Pacific epistemic community, metrocentrist epistemic community, and Pacific Village epistemic community. We have to work together as an epistemic community, all three. All right, and then I say here that the collaboration of epistemic communities is laudable. We have to do that, it's laudable. It's only, one voice won't give an answer to all the intricacies, stuff that we go through. We have to work together because I think more heads is better than one. All right, it ensures greater power of control over the epistemic enterprise and epistemic product. The question then comes to mind, but does it ensure Pacificness in the Pacific product? Because one of the arguments behind developing Pacific-based, or in these Pacific methodologies, is that we'll give rise to a sort of a more image of Pacificness. Is doing this going to do that? All right. How much Pacificness do we want or expect our epistemic product to have when we engage in Pacific enterprise, applying methodologies? And how much Pacificness can epistemic product have when we apply, for example, Kakala, the methodology that I think Kanai has developed? Talanoa is very famous, very popular, we all know that. Ho'oponopono is Hawaiian. We have a Hawaiian scholar here, so he probably will tell us later on. But having lived in Hawaii and studied in Hawaii, I sort of took to that. It was very important. And they see it as a way of making right. But for me, it is both a methodology, an epistemology, and a pedagogy. It embraces those three, so that's why I use it. Fa'amanata'anga from Kwarai, my own work, same thing. And Fa'ananola, I think that's from Kabita's work. And then does it matter that we do this? If you say, well, no, it doesn't matter as long as it's some taste of Pacificness in it. I think then the driving spirit towards epistemic decolonization is political and not necessarily epistemic. You can see that I'm sort of leaning more and more towards epistemic knowledge, whole knowledge, because I think much of our work has been sort of political, which is very good, but we'll come to that point later. But I'm going in the direction of knowledge itself. All right, you may be wondering, where is this all coming from? What's the data behind all this? Yeah. Oh, it's time up. Oh. Mike. All right. Okay. Is that better? All right. Field data. Since being back in the Solomon Islands, after Canterbury and Auckland, I've been involved in all kinds of activities. I'm been asked to teach a postgraduate course in research methodology to senior lecturers at the Solomon National University. Invited to give talks. Been asked to be a member of the task force that the Prime Minister's office has asked us to do, to sort of establish the Solomons Research Institute. And then invited to all kinds of workshops on curriculum development and so forth. And then at the moment, I'm based in the Office of Research and Postgraduate Studies at CNU. So that's what I'm doing. And in attending all these different activities, giving talks and stuff, I sort of, not so much collect data, but I get information from talks, dialogue, discussion with groups that I think I sort of took home and analyzed. And I think they sort of give me a pretty good understanding of how Solomon Islanders have been portrayed and feel where they stand in terms of research in the Solomon Islands. And these are some recurrent themes, and I just go through them because even though these are Solomon Islands, I have a feeling that if you do the same thing in other parts of the Pacific, I think you'll find same things, similar issues, recurring themes. Some Islanders tell me that in their research with other people from the metropolis, some Islanders societies do not have knowledge. What they have is only information, right? Knowledge acquired through osmosis, and not conscious, deliberate, or purposeful searching or research. It's something that kind of comes to you rather than something we deliberately go out to seek, to find out. And that research was introduced during colonization, which is quite interesting. No ethical principles to guide research, some of the issues that people talk about. Knowledge or knowing is haphazard, subjective, opinion-based, and basically unreliable. Right? No clear understanding of what knowledge is, hence no word for knowledge in the indigenous languages of the Solomon Islands. I take easy to that because I have words in my language that means knowledge. So I don't know where these guys are getting their data or information from, but it's good. I mean, it gives us something to think about and gives us ideas as to where we should be heading in terms of refining our research agendas and where we take a knowledge construction and quest in the Pacific. All right, no systematic thinking, and thinking has no clear path, and so meanders. There's no systematic thinking. It is all over the place, as I would say. And critical thinking is not possible with opinion. Opinion doesn't work. Knowing lacks path and breadth, lacks depth and breadth, because it is primarily opinion. All right, and that knowing or knowledge is bedeviled by uncertainty, right? So that people lack confidence in what they know. So that if probed further, people tend to lose their trains of thoughts. Shows you that you don't do that with knowledge. When you have knowledge, you don't do that. You could be probed further and you can still hold your ground. Whereas with opinion, if you probe further, you lose it because it's just opinion. It's not really knowledge. All right? What else? And that knowing is ephemeral or fleeting. Here today, gone tomorrow. And that he said that this is inevitable in cultures with no writing system. So the writing system is very important. It captures, it freezes knowledge. Now, this is coming from the stuff that I've collected from attending these workshops, giving these talks, and so forth. All right. Now, that's a lot of data to talk on what I've just presented. So I'm not going to talk about it because each of those points, I think, as you know, could be or should be a paper of its own. I'm not going to do that. I don't have time. So what I'll just focus on is the whole position that research was introduced into the Pacific, or into the Solomons and then the Pacific, that there was no research prior to that. All right? And I do this because for a lot of reasons. It means it has implications for whether knowledge existed in the Solomon Islands before colonization. By the same token, has implications for whether or not knowledge existed or exists in other indigenous societies, or traditional societies in the Pacific, Samoa, Tonga, Niue, Cook Islands, Vanuatu, Papua New Guinea. Right? And it also has implications for whether or not every person in the metropolis thinks or thought the way the metrocentric epistemic community did during colonization. So when we say that they're wrong, the colonization, we may be talking about just a community and not the rest of the metropolis or not the rest of the Western world. So I think we need to keep some of these things in focus. And it also has implications for all of us as members of a post-colonial epistemic community to agree on an epistemic positional stand and make it a constituent of the epistemic paradigm shift we are seeking through epistemic decolonization. All right. All right. Okay, was there a in this specific research? There certainly was, yeah. There's no question about that. The fact that, and these are some of the reasons I give that shows, and these to sort of substantiate my position. Then when you look at it, there is a socio-ontological practice of conditions that research brought together, and these are some of the pleasant practice of conditions, and these are some of the not so pleasant practices of conditions. Now, that only comes about through research. This is knowledge, because when something, say, for example, culture or religious practices, or justice, or sex, or gender, or humor. Humor is very big in the Pacific. It's not something that happens overnight. It's part of our culture, so it must have been developed some time ago and becomes knowledge. And then we have these not so pleasant things. Again, we say, well, they are part of our knowledge construction. So, yeah, we take them in. You're saying to do is to show that, yeah, there was research in Pacific societies prior to Western contact, or prior to colonization. So that's Pacific indigenous research. Now, Pacific introduced research, or Western research, or methods, also came. I mean, it came with its own agenda. It's a different kind of research. It looks at things differently, or looks at issues very differently, and these are just some examples to show you. The socio-ontological practices or conditions, literacy, writing system, political statehood. Yeah, we didn't have this prior to Westernization. Some of our societies have this. Say Hawaii, for example, it was a kingdom long before the US came and, is it right over there? So, yeah, this Christianity, centralized healthcare system, we didn't have that. When someone got sick in the village, you just went to a healer. The person went into the forest, brings a few leaves or something, mix them up, and then gives you that kind of thing. Whereas Western research or colonization brought in a centralized. Then these are some of not so pleasant practices, or the inherent practices of colonization. I don't want to tell you, you know it. So this gives you that, yeah. These two traditions are defined or marked by some very distinct characteristics. And you may say, is there enough ground for scientific argument? I would strongly say yes. Those conditions say yes. At the end of the day, what is research but knowledge constructed by certain persons to address certain challenges in society at a certain time period? That's all knowledge is. I mean, you can define it in all kinds of ways, but basically that's what it boils down to. All right, now that's research. Now I'd like to jump to something that has been part of our society since Western contact or Western influence. And our societies have developed into what I call a socio-ontological duality. Winding down. All right, okay. Which is characterized by tradition and modern. Coexisting, existing together. And you find this in virtually everything in our Pacific societies today. Epistemic duality, political duality, Western, religious duality, you name it. All this happened when our societies came face to face or tried to merge with Western paradigms. And this, for me, has been one of the problems, or the leading challenges in our research today, because I would like to just say that it has created something of if you will, a mixed bag of a socio-ontological condition that would require us to do more than using the sort of conventional paradigms in doing research. We need to do a bit more than that in order to be able to capture this. All right. And then I just talk about some political implications for this. In terms of political, the project, we have been doing really well. Researchers have been doing really well. And you can see from our political independence, Samoa, going all the way back to 1962. That's great. We've been doing really well in the political project. We're not doing really well in what I see here as an epistemic project. We've done well establishing some universities, Papua New Guinea, NUS, National University Samoa, Guam, Solomon's National University. We've been but I think in many ways we still kind of have some ways to go yet in the fulfilling of advancing this epistemic project. Now that sounds like, oh my gosh, what a charge. I mean, like, hopeless, I mean, negative. Is there hope? No, there's hope. We can do it. I mean, these conditions are created by human beings or by people, and because of that, we can correct them too. And so here's what I'm saying, it's not negative after all. It's not hopeless after all. We can do it. All right, let me just close here. Let me pay homage to the NZIPR. That through research, it encourages or helps specific communities meet or address the challenges posed by the current state of socio-ontological duality. When I look at their list, when they sent me the announcement and I saw the list of topics, I said, oh my gosh, haven't we been through this so many times? I think these are very common. But then the more I thought about it, the more I said, no, they're requiring us to do more than what we've been doing. And that's how I salute NZIPR for doing this kind of research. It's asking us to push forward. And my interpretation is that I think they want us to do more on the epistemic project. I think we have done enough on the political project. Now let's do more on the epistemic project. And then I'll just say here, the socio-ontological duality is here to stay. It is going to be here. I mean, there's no running away from that. It will be here. And it is our new socio-cultural ontology. This is what it is. And it is our new Pacific. We have to face it. We have to do something about it. Thank you very much.
Oh.
All right.
Thank you, One Talk.
Oh.
Sorry, I had to cut you short.
All right. Oh, thank you. Okay.
Thanks to our philosopher. I had the experience as a postgraduate student at the Australian National University of sharing a room next door to a philosopher. And I learned very quickly a conversation with a philosopher needs time. And I'm sorry we had to cut our philosopher short, but we do have quite a heavy program that we have to move forward. I think David has challenged us not to get complacent, not to think that somehow we've moved seamlessly into other ways of thinking, not to forget the legacies of colonial domination, but equally to acknowledge the great thought and thinking knowledge that existed in societies that have been in this part of the world for tens of thousands of years. So thank you, David, for many of the things you reminded us of, and thank you for reminding me of Discourse with a Philosopher. Let's thank David again for his presentation. Audience, we move now to the final of our morning keynotes. That really is a feast, as David suggested early on. And it gives me real pleasure to introduce Kapilialoha Sproat from Hawaii, who is going to give us some perspectives from the northern part of the Pacific. I think in this opening session we've been really privileged to have speakers who have drawn on knowledges from the Eastern Pacific, from the Western Pacific, and we are now going to hear from someone from the North. There is a brief description on page 16 of Professor Sproat's background and her work. I won't repeat all that. In the interest of time, I would invite her to come and speak to us. That's who we've come to hear. Thank you.
Aloha mai kākou. Ku'uone hana o Kalihiwai ma ka mokupuni o mana o Kalanipo. Aloha mai kākou a pau. Mahalo for the great privilege of being here this morning with all of you, and mahalo in particular to the New Zealand Institute for Pacific Research and my friend Dr. Lisa Uparesa for the great privilege of being with all of you. This morning I'm going to start us off by examining a bit on Native Hawaiians' potential deployment of local laws that embody restorative justice principles to fashion meaningful remedies for the environmental and cultural damage as a result of the global climate crisis. And this approach to guide and in some instances actually compel decision makers to take action is critical, and it takes advantage of some of the unique opportunities that we have available to us as Indigenous people. So by doing so, I'm hopeful that it proffers one way to act upon our status and to effect an Indigenous right to environmental self-determination. But first things first, especially in our Pacific tradition, right? I come from the Akana and Sproat Ohana of Kalihiwai, Kauai, and Honokane Nui, Hawaii Island, and Kohala. And this is my Onehanau in Kalihiwai on Kauai, where my mother's people have been since the time of Lono'i Kahiki. Kauai has changed a lot over the years since I was growing up. Back then it was a lot more rural and undeveloped. I think we now have the dubious distinction of having the most billionaires with a B per capita of all of the Hawaiian Islands, but it's still an incredibly special place. And at heart, I'm really just a simple girl from the country. I'm deeply honored to come from a family of farmers and fishers. And my papa, who you can see here, William John Napuahala Ena Akana, he was a konahiki, or a traditionally trained resource manager in our Makai reaches, or our nearshore marine waters. So here you can see behind me, except for Richard, who I'm blocking, you can see they've just completed gathering or surrounding a school of akule, or mackerel. So he helped to take care of resources, basically, that we relied on to put food on our dinner tables. For akule in Kalihiwai, for he'e, or octopus, from Hanapai to Wanini, and for mullet in Kalihiwai River in Kahili. And so I was really fortunate to grow up incredibly close to the land and sea. And we gathered or grew, as I mentioned, much of the food that ended up on our dinner tables. And nowadays it's cool to be kua'aina. People are, proud to be of the land, but that really hasn't been the case, I think, in Hawaii or for many other places in the Pacific. But I'm incredibly grateful that I grew up with a strong sense of self and culture, because I think that really has rooted both myself, but also my work. And it provides an incredible cultural context, but also I think my family's pride and cultural identity really helped to instill a strong sense of kuleana, the responsibility and the privilege really to malama our natural and cultural resources so that our culture can persevere. So in my day job, I'm a law professor at the University of Hawaii, and I direct Kahuliao, which is the university's Center for Excellence in Native Hawaiian Law. And we are an academic center that promotes education, scholarship, community outreach, and collaboration on issues of law, culture, and justice, not just for us as Kanaka, but for other Pacific and Indigenous people as well. Our name, Kahuliao, literally means turning towards the light. And as you can see in our logo with the picture of the kalo plant turning towards the sun, this really embodies our educational philosophy, which is to take the very best of our Indigenous traditions in pursuit of scholarship, enlightenment, and justice. But in my real job, I'm a wife and mother to 2 boys who are 3 and almost 5. So the truth of the matter is my work is never done. I got the most sleep last night because I was here by myself than I have in many years. But I think, like you, our pursuit of scholarship, enlightenment, and justice really takes superhero strength, whether that's, Black Panther or whatever else. But for my keynote this morning, I plan to share a bit about our Kanaka Maoli, or Native Hawaiian culture and practices, and how they are tied to specific natural and cultural resources. I'll also overview some of the research on the impacts of global warming in Hawaii and how that affects our indigenous culture in particular. And then I'll discuss a little bit about the legal framework and the constitutional provisions in particular that I believe provide unique opportunities to import international human rights norms at the local level. And finally, I'll provide a bit more detail on those norms and how they can and in fact should inform decision-making impacting indigenous people. And so this provides a broad template that I've examined in the context of Hawaii, but I believe is also applicable throughout the Pacific and actually around the world. So to better understand the impacts of global warming on Kanaka Maoli, or Native Hawaiians, as we call ourselves, we really need some insight into our traditional worldview. And so there are many different perspectives on this, and I think, like anything Native Hawaiian law, anything else, you can have a million perspectives. I could spend the whole time just talking about that. But given our time this morning, this is my 3-slide version. So, the Kumulipo is really our great cosmogonic origin chant that traces the beginning of, Native Hawaiians to the birth of time in Hawaii. And although we have ties throughout Polynesia, we really believe that in the beginning there was Po, or darkness, and from this darkness came life. Po gave birth to Kumulipo and Po'ele, and through their union, all of our natural world was created. And so Kumulipo and Po'ele's first child was a coral polyp, which created the foundation for all life in our sea. Then all plants and animals in the ocean and on land were born in sequential order, one after another. And this is all traced through 16 Va, right? And they are Kumulipo, they're Kumulipo. They are Aumakua, or guardians that protect us still. And so Po had many children. It took a while because it had to comprise all the aspects of the natural world. But after all of the Hawaiian Islands and all of these entities were born, then Wakea, our sky father, had a child with Ho'okukalani. Unfortunately, this child was stillborn, but where they buried him outside of their home, a kalo plant grew from his grave. Wakea and Ho'okukalani then had a second child, which was the first Maoli, the first human child born in Hawaii. And so for us, the Kumulipo provides incredible and invaluable perspective because it helps to explain really our familial relationship that we have to all of our natural and cultural resources, and to kalo in particular, not just as our staple food, which indeed it is, but actually as our elder sibling. And because of this kuleana, this responsibility and privilege, and some people when they talk about kuleana mistakenly refer to that as a right. But it's not. It's really a duty, a cultural duty, and a privilege to help to care for our natural resources as a public trust for present and future generations. So this understanding is also reflected in our traditional approaches to resource management. In fact, our word in our own language for land, or aina, literally means that which feeds. And our traditional systems of resource management were intricate. They were also interdependent. Our ali'i, or our chiefs, held resources in trust. They were trustees. They had fiduciary duties, as the lawyers like to call them. So they managed the resources, and the ho'aina, or the people of the land, cultivated these resources throughout the ahupua'a, right? So from the mountains, not just down to the shoreline, but actually out into the ocean. We had ocean gardens that we cultivated on our reefs. And so our tradition and custom really reflected these practices, and that was the law of the land, although it was later reduced to writing. Now, the particulars of life in early Hawaii really varied by region. A lot of people think of us as one place, but we are 8 distinct islands with many microclimates, really, on each of the various islands. And so our culture was, and actually remains, incredibly place-based and resource-specific. I come from the North Shore of Kauai, and so incredibly blessed to have a lot of water resources. So I was raised eating fish and poi 3 meals a day because we have a lot of water. And so we have a lot of kalo and we can eat poi. Where my father's family is from on Hawaii Island, if you're from the kaha lands there, which are basically the lava fields, you don't get to eat poi 3 meals a day because that's just not what's available. And so our agricultural and aquacultural methods really evolved to adapt to the unique environments that we found. And this shaped everything from our regional culture, consumption patterns, everything. And so the point being really that our resources provide the foundation for our identity as Kanaka and also for our spirituality and our daily survival. Now, the documented arrival of Westerners in Hawaii in about 1778 was, in many senses, the beginning of the end. It imposed incredible physical and cultural genocide, as was the case with indigenous people the world over. We were particularly susceptible to introduced diseases because of our isolation being in Hawaii for so many years. And so our population went from between 800,000 to 1 million at the time of contact to less than 40,000 within the first century of contact. And at the same time, political demand for goods both strained our traditional subsistence economy while also fueling political instability that ultimately culminated in the illegal overthrow of our sovereign government by the United States in 1893. And so, due to this increasing political instability and the impacts on the Hawaiiana, the people of the land, laws were passed during the kingdom period, so from the 1800s, to protect the continued exercise of Hawaiian custom and tradition, and really to enable people to continue to live traditional lifestyles and practice these pathways in a more modern context. And so many of these persist in Hawaii today in amended forms. In fact, Hawaii Revised Statutes 1-1, the first statute of in our law books, adopts English common law except as it's modified by Hawaiian custom and tradition, or the judicial precedent of our kingdom. So this plays an important role, which we are resurrecting quite effectively. But I'll also discuss that in more detail shortly. So these protections for traditional and customary Native Hawaiian rights and practices are proving even more important today in the face of global climate change. And as you all well know, and as I'm sure we'll hear over the next 2 days, throughout the Pacific, tremendous impacts have already been documented. And scientific studies have established that over the last 100 years in Hawaii, at least, we have seen impacts across the board, similar to what I'm sure people are experiencing here and beyond. Our rainfall patterns are changing. In some areas, they're decreasing significantly. In other areas that were more dry, we're seeing more episodic flooding. But lots of changes. Our stream discharges, the amount of water that we have flowing in our streams has also been decreasing, and in particular the base flow. And that's important because base flow is the groundwater component of stream flow. So setting aside what happens if you have a flood or if it's raining, the base flow is what's always there. And what we're seeing is that that amount is dropping between 20 to 70%, so not insignificant. At the same time, over 70% of our beaches are eroding, and we've already lost about 13 miles of beach, so very significant. And about 80% of the projections are that erosion from our shorelines by 2050 is going to be about 80 feet and about 200 feet by 2100. And it's not going to stop there. And much of this research, I have to say, has been provided by Dr. Chip Fletcher at the University of Hawaii. We've been very fortunate to have a lot of people in our own community documenting these impacts. And I also want to note that I purposely included this graphic of global warming because I'm a law professor, I'm not a scientist. But even for non-scientists, these changes are significant. And as a Native Hawaiian practitioner, I have serious concerns about what this means for my culture. And more change looms on the horizon. Recent studies in Hawaii, largely by Professor Fletcher and others, project that it's only going to get worse. We're going to see increased increases. Ambient air temperature is going to be higher. Lots of sea level rise. The projections only continue to get worse. When I started doing this work several years ago, we were saying, okay, we're going to see maybe a 3 feet increase or 1 meter increase in sea level rise by 2100. Now that estimate is up to 6.2 feet, so more than double in just a couple of years, and I'm sure that trend will continue. Ocean temperatures are also contributing to ocean acidification and bleaching. And in May 2013, atmospheric concentrations of CO2 on Mauna Loa, one of our highest mountains, exceeded 400 parts per million for the first time in the 55 years of measurement, but really likely in more than 300 million years. So this is an ominous sign of what might come next, especially given the deadly effects that we're already seeing: rising seas, wildfires, extreme weather of all kinds. And like others, we're experiencing many more storm events. So major impacts. And this is just a graphic depiction of what the scientists believe our climate crisis in Hawaii has or will continue to look at. I already mentioned some of these changes, including the base flow in our streams. I included this graphic in particular because for the first time they're recognizing that cultural practices will be impacted, although our burial sites really should be more down here. But at least they're getting there. So, and so what does all of this mean for us as Native Hawaiians or even other local people in Hawaii who depend on place-based culture? Well, scientists and Native Hawaiian practitioners agree that some of the things we're talking about, like the declining stream levels and the declining stream flows and the rising sea levels, are going to threaten things like coastal plain agriculture, right? So the kalo that I talked about earlier at the beginning, which is so significant for us, not just as our staple food, but as our elder sibling. Kalo cultivation requires a continuous supply of fresh-flowing water in order to survive. But if we keep having declining stream flows, what does that mean? Changing wind and weather patterns are also going to affect other practices like traditional wayfinding. Our va'a, Hokulea, just circumnavigated island Earth and is planning on circumnavigating the Pacific. But will we be able to continue this in the future if we have more and more storms and if our weather patterns continue to change in a way that we can't track them? At the same time, rising sea levels and increased erosion is going to devastate subsistence fisheries and our fish ponds in particular, because that mix of the fresh and salt water is so critical in order for us to be able to grow food. At the same time, our declining forest health is going to impact gathering. You know, a lot of the adornments that we use for hula and other protocol all comes from these Malka or upland regions. So put simply, global warming jeopardizes our ability to be able to continue living Hawaiian culture. And the science is corroborated by what our communities are experiencing on the ground. Just one example from my own family: a warmer and more acidic ocean impacts coral reefs, fish, and marine life, including limu, that we all gather and eat on a regular basis. So my own family, we're already seeing the decline of cultural resources that we have relied upon for many, many generations. And for most of us as kanaka, makahana ka'ike, right? The learning or the knowing is actually in the doing, in the continuation of these practices. And so our culture is really dependent upon these resources in order to survive. And so our identity as Indigenous people is defined by our connection to these particular places and practices. We can't just relocate to someplace else because then the practice is different. It can't continue. So in this way, global warming really threatens not just our island home, but our identity as a people. And so what can we do about this? Well, for starters, I look to our constitutional provisions that we have in Hawaii. Article 11, Section 1 is our general public trust provision, and it mandates that our decision makers have to conserve and protect our natural resources and have to do so by promoting uses that are consistent with our conservation and furthering self-sufficiency. The key provision there is that all public natural resources are held in trust by the state for the people. So in Hawaii, we have incredibly strong constitutional public trust provisions, which have been developed largely around the use and allocation of our water resources. But what's interesting and very special about the public trust in Hawaii is that it's grounded in Kanaka Maoli, or Native Hawaiian custom and tradition, right? So I talked earlier about our common law and how that's adopts English common law except as it's modified by Hawaiian custom and tradition. So it's our indigenous approach that informs our interpretation of things like our constitutional provisions, and in part, really our kuleana, or the cultural duty that's associated with resource protection. So given climate's impacts, there are specific provisions, public trust provisions pertaining to freshwater resources, and in 2000, the Hawaii Supreme Court ruled that the two constitutional provisions that I just mentioned adopt the public trust as a fundamental principle of constitutional law in Hawaii. very quickly, because I know everybody loves the Constitution, but just a couple more provisions. Article 11, Section 9 is a right to a clean environment. And I mention this because many people see this as an important corollary or part of the public trust. And just last year, in December of 2017, the Hawaii Supreme Court actually ruled that this provision gives individuals the right to be heard and to protect their environmental interests. So we see this as being an important tool that's going to be leveraged by our communities in order to force change. And we also have a specific constitutional provision, Article 12, Section 7, that mandates the protection of traditional and customary Native Hawaiian rights and practices. And finally, I just want to highlight this provision, Article 12, Section 5. The point being that in creating this entity, OHA, that's supposed to be directed to improve the conditions of Native Hawaiians, there's an important restorative justice underpinning to all of the constitutional provisions that I mentioned, but this one in particular, because OHA was created to be a receptacle for reparations. And so I mention that because I think restorative justice is an important aspect that other folks can use, because that creates a portal to import international human rights norms at the local level. But what does it mean, right, this whole restorative justice thing? So we have all these constitutional provisions, we have a bevy of case law or decisions by the Hawaii Supreme Court that say, okay, this is the law. But yet it remains unclear for agencies what this concept means in practice. There's been no clear delineation in the law, and so where do we look for guidance regarding how restorative justice not just can, but really should be actualized on the ground and in our communities? Well, one important starting point that my research has looked at is to look at these restorative justice principles for Native peoples that are embodied in our human rights principles of self-determination. So these are international norms, and there are 4 values in particular that I'll talk about in a couple slides that provide firm guidance for us in Hawaii and for us throughout the Blue Continent, really, regarding how we can actualize restorative justice, especially in the face of global climate change. And so in searching for an answer to this issue of Native people's cultural survival in the face of global climate change, scholars have acknowledged that there are limitations for Native people's legal options, at least, as to how we can address this. And they've really encouraged the use of domestic laws like our Constitution that Hawaii looked at, which has only become even more important during our Trump era. So we can't count on Washington, D.C., or really even America to be able to address these changes. In fact, when Trump stepped back and said, okay, I'm not going to recognize the Paris Accord, Hawaii was the first state that stepped forward and independently adopted it, both at the state level and at the county level. So we believe that this approach in using restorative justice is critical because it helps to operationalize what's called an Indigenous people's right to environmental self-determination. And you can't mention that without giving tremendous respect to Rebecca Sozi, who's an incredibly distinguished Native American law scholar. And she's who helped to conceptualize this idea of an indigenous right to environmental self-determination. And that is the right to survive as a distinct people, and the right to really restrain national governments from undertaking policies that are going to undermine our continued cultural survival. And so this also imposes affirmative requirements on nation states to engage in mitigation strategies to avoid catastrophic harm to Indigenous people and our practices and lifeways. And so incredibly apt in the face of global climate change. So that sounds good, right? Oh, good, we'll just do what Professor Sozi said, but how do we go about doing that? Well, Professor Sozi explains that environmental self-determination is really a human rights-based Indigenous environmental justice claim, and it's important because it's rooted in self-determination instead of sovereignty. Because many people have recognized that sovereignty can be insufficient to protect Native people from the impacts of climate change. So this is a distinct set of rights that arises from our unique cultural and political status that enables us as Indigenous people to protect traditional land-based cultural practices, regardless of whether or not there's an independent sovereign right to govern those lands. And you can also prevent practices that jeopardize cultural resources. So it evokes a human rights-based set of norms rather than a domestic sovereignty model. And this is especially helpful in Hawaii because America has not federally recognized Kanaka Maoli as Indigenous people, although that has happened at the state level. So the question then becomes, how do Native people realize this seemingly abstract right of environmental self-determination, especially in this real economic and political world with on-the-ground climate change impacts that we're already seeing? And so this can be complicated. So I put together an article because I only have 5 minutes. So you folks can read the article if you're really interested. No. But very quickly, our responses have to be driven by Native people's choices, but we all know that this is going to entail interaction with state and local entities, private businesses, non-Indigenous residents, and more. And so these interactions are also informed by the relevant legal regime. And in Hawaii, for us, those are the constitutional provisions that I mentioned, protecting traditional, customary, Native Hawaiian rights, and also the public trust doctrine. So, in this context, these norms are often expressed as values. And so it's really important to use this framework to kind of operationalize this Indigenous right to environmental self-determination. So the 4 values that are at issue are cultural integrity, lands and other resources, social welfare and development, and self-government. And each of these 4 realms is recognized as being a salient dimension of restorative justice for Native peoples. And so these 4 values were actually identified by Professor Jim Anaya, who is a former United Nations Special Rapporteur on Indigenous people. And he has recognized that they're critical in achieving restorative justice for Native peoples, but for Native Hawaiians in particular. So these are minimum standards for the development of remedial measures to address the impacts of colonization. And so local decision makers can utilize this framework by weighing the impacts of proposed decisions on the 4 values. And in my article, I apply several different scenarios, including looking at the impacts of kalo cultivation, because kalo is such an important cultural practice for us. I mean, my kids eat poi for breakfast. And we have these strong protections, these constitutional provisions, but the reality is that it's very difficult to utilize this right. And so one way to do that one way to operationalize it is to use the 4 values in considering the impacts of proposed decisions having to do with kalo cultivation. And so that's part of what my article does and how I help to address it. And if folks have questions, there's more information here. That's a citation for it. Also at Kahulia, we recently put together a Native Hawaiian law treatise. It's the first Indigenous law treatise that I know of if anyone is interested. And if you don't want to read all 21 chapters and 1,400 pages, we have individual chapters available for your e-reader. But in closing, I'd just like to reference a wanana, or prophecy, that we have back home in Hawaii. So nearly 200 years ago, a high priest stood atop the walls of Paku'iheiau on the island of Molokai, and they divined the burning death and the heavy downpour of rain that would overtake the island. And they foresaw the onslaught of tremendous devastation. But they were also confident that from this destruction, the people of the land, the people of the Lepopopolo, the dark earth, would rise up and branch out into the heavens to take control. So I believe that time has come. Mahalo. Right on time. Thank you. Oops. Thank you.
Here's a little gift. The University of Auckland's late. Once again, a great presentation, great insight into one of the greatest contemporary challenges that we're facing. We are running a bit behind schedule, so what I'm going to do now is just give you one very brief piece of housekeeping. Then we shall have a break for, say, 20 minutes, and then go into the 3 concurrent sessions which follow after the break. A bit of housekeeping is mandatory. If there's a fire, please go outside into the melee outside and wait out there. If there's an earthquake, do the same thing. You don't have to drop, cover and hold as you do in Christchurch. You get out the door and wait outside. If you're looking for toilets, they're in a corridor just behind the building here. I don't think I've missed anything out, have I? No? Damon's not shaking his head. And the program hopefully tells you where the 3 concurrent sessions are. If not, then hopefully we will have somebody who can tell us during the morning tea, because I can't quite remember off the top of my head. So let's thank again our keynote speakers for the morning, for what literally was, to use David's words, a feast of ideas, a feast of challenges, and some really thought-provoking concepts that we need to reflect on as we move forward with our work in Pacific research. Thank you very much, speakers.